when you were first going out there talking to companies, where did you start with the data? Were you categorizing it and then just built models to make prediction? Describe a little bit of the mechanics. You have a big data set. How do you start labeling it? How do you start identifying what your key signals are to start extracting important bits of information? What is the process like to do that? And when you were first going out?
Yeah, it's a great question. And a lot about data is you don't know exactly what's in the data and no one can tell you before. So you have to start digging and you have to start experimenting. And then you slowly start to figure out actually what's going on. And it's a little bit like research. You need to understand what's deeply in the data. And the way we did it most of the times were we were starting to run very structured experiments. We were trying out stuff like fast iteration on certain like hypotheses that we had on what we wanted to figure out. And by running these experiments, you start getting signals on the potential value in the data.
Yeah.
That maybe some examples you've probably heard before. Think about pricing, dynamic pricing, risk adjustment. Prices aren't always the same. They change all the time, and they do change it maybe looks very unstructured to the outside user, but in the end, it's a very structured process behind by algorithms trying out different of prices or price structures. And by doing that, you can really narrowly measure on actually what changes of the algorithm would have what change on a user perspective, on conversion rates, on price elasticities, and so on and so forth. And that's pretty much the approach we were running.
Yeah, I can imagine that the data is not always clean though. And what do you do in the sense when a data or you're missing components of data? Do you just put some kind of like a variable that kind of sits in its place, or what do you do in particular to make sure that the model doesn't get broken when you're working with a big data set and if you have missing components to it?
Yeah, one thing every person who's worked with data has realized: real world data is always very messy. That's not a Kaggle challenge where you get a well-structured and nicely set up data set and you can start running your models on it. Real world data is always messy and it's a big pain to clean it up. So, that's part of the work. But I think apart from only like cleaning up the data set, the very interesting piece and also like the insight that we then got over these years was what is actually the right infrastructure to do that on. Because you can do something in your notebook and you can try to do something very manually. But in the end, most teams want to actually control their decision flows on their own and want to do all of that on their own. And that's also like the interesting path of trying out building machine learning models for other companies. At some point in time, two things that we figured out. And the one was they actually want to own all of the models themselves. If you go to a bank, if you go to an insurance company and you're thinking of risk models, it's the heart. It's so deeply important also from a regulatory perspective, but also from a business perspective that you own these models. And then the second thing is that a lot of the work in the end, when you build models and if you think about decision flows, if you think about decision logic, goes actually into building the infrastructure that you can start experimenting and iterating very fast. Kind of like you give the tools and the shovels to people that they can actually start running on their own. And kind of like that's what actually led us then to start the company in 2020, because we saw how much value could be created by delivering this infrastructure to then internal risk teams, data science teams, business teams that actually are responsible for designing these flows nowadays.